Does China have a better system? Like, what should people emulate?
Right. Well, I'm not one that insists on the superiority of one system. We do in the West. We say that's really in a way what this whole conflict is about. We have the best system. It's the end of history. There's nothing better, and the rest of the world has to accept it. That's the supremacist, hegemonic kind of thinking that we have. But the Chinese and the Russians and the Indians, they don't say that. That's not the argument they're making. It's just like, oh, we have the best system and you have to copy ours. We have, if you don't adopt our system, we're going to carry out a color revolution in your country. No, each of these systems is really quite different. And so the argument that let's say on the ideological front, the points that the Russians and the Chinese and others within that, let's say, that loose collection of allies and partners, they're saying is, again, we're talking about multipolarity. We're talking about allowing each country to go down its own civilizational path. And that's what we stand for. Now, it's interesting that actually and I think that's right. They're describing the reality. This is a realistic assessment of what they're looking at. And what they're fighting is this insistence on imposing one system on the world. So that's how they frame it. And I think they framed it correctly. That's what's happening. On the other side, they are, I think, as you say, are living in the past. It's just like, I remember the days of the first Cold War. It was the free world. We often refer to ourselves, it was the free world against communist tyranny. And there was, it was somewhat exaggerated, but there was a lot of truth to that. And both sides actually understood what it was about. Yeah, we're about communism, socialism on this side. You're about capitalism on that side. And that's the fight. And everybody understood it. So in a way, there was an agreement about what the conflict was about on both sides. But this time, I think you can say that those who are in the multipolar camp, are framing it as multipolarity versus Western hegemony. And I think they're framing it correctly. But on the other side, we insist on talking about a fight between democracy and authoritarianism. But the other side is not insisting on authoritarianism. I think it's fair to call, for example, definitely it's fair to call the Chinese system authoritarian. But as you pointed out, it's also very, very successful. And you can say from your own experience that most Chinese are very, very happy with the way things are working there. I think there's much more support for the government there than there is, for example, within this country for our government. And then the same with Russia. It's described as authoritarian, and Putin's a dictator. He's obviously not a dictator, and it has some authoritarian elements, I think you'd say, but there's also a lot of democratic elements, and it's its own thing. And again, it seems to be very successful. And you look at what's happened over the last 25 years under Putin, and people are very happy with it. Again, I can speak from direct experience, especially through your sister who's lived there for 5 years. So it's not, and nobody on that side is saying we're insisting on authoritarianism. There are other people within the alliance, like India and whatever, that are, very much democracies. And so it says there's no argument on that side against democracy. When people are brought into BRICS, they say, oh, you're a democratic country, we can't bring you in here. No, of course, there are democratic countries that are brought in there. There are also monarchies that are brought in. There are authoritarian countries, that are brought in. There's all kinds of countries. It is about multipolarity. It's about, true diversity, civilizational, political diversity. So we're not, on our side, we are living in the past. We've kind of reverted to this old rhetoric. It's freedom versus authoritarianism. I think also we're not looking at what's happening within our own countries. because increasingly in places like, especially in Great Britain and Germany, there are growing authoritarian tendencies and real crackdowns on free speech, that are, according to many measures, you can say there's more freedom of speech in Russia than there is in England or Germany, for example. But we don't, we don't, again, I don't think we're being honest about it. We're not framing it honestly. And then when it comes to countries like Romania, Moldova, clearly our commitment to democracy is, let's say, highly qualified. So I'll say it's just a false framing on our side. And it is a kind of a refusal to recognize the new realities. We are living in the past. So yeah, we often, especially in the conservative side of the spectrum, when we talk about China, it's always communist China, communist China. We both know enough about China that it's communist only in the name. It's led by the Communist Party, but they have pursued a radically different policy from what was pursued under Mao Zedong and the Gang of Four. And it's again, only communist. It's in name only. There's plenty of capitalism, plenty of free enterprise, and even a celebration of traditional thinking and so forth. All of those things which you could never have found under the Communist Party as it was founded. The original one that ran China for the first few decades after the Communist Revolution. It's something else entirely now.
Yeah, I like how you said just about this false framing, this lens that how we look at things, in the rhetoric that we use, the language that we use, and I realized I was just always thinking that it was the elite that had this hegemonic thinking, but I realized that it all trickles down to all of us here in the West. Because we use that language, and I even think about it sometimes like that. Okay, we're using the term communism or authoritarianism, freedom, democracy. It's just so part of our vernacular but us in the West, we're the only ones that are thinking about it that way. Oh, there's this authoritarian government and it's communist here, and you see it just every time you turn on the news, communist China. They're doing, as into sort of indoctrinating all of us, like, oh, there's this big ideological fight, but the ideological fight is only for us on the West. Nobody in the others, they're like, what are you talking about? Like, what are you doing? What are you doing? We're doing our own thing here. Nobody's bothering you, and we're just framing it all as us versus them. That's how everything is. So it's that the terminology is so important. The language that we use, but I don't know if we can change. We can't change that, right? I mean, we need to update these terms because people are still stuck in that. It's just, especially the boomers. You're an exception, and not all boomers. I know we have a lot of older people watching the show as well, but a lot of people, they're just sort of stuck in the past. It's just like, oh, it's the commies versus the free world.
Right. I think you find that's true, especially among older conservative people. They still seem to think that the great threat is Marxism. Marxism is really gone. It died a long time ago. And yeah, it's a whole new world that we need to wake up to.
Do we need to update these terms? But we can't do it. It just will have to naturally. At what point? Because these terms are so outdated, but they've long lived past their applicable, usage, in time. I feel like 20, 30 years ago, maybe you could have been using some of these terms more, but now it's just something different, but we're still using them.
Right. Well, it's a problem if you're part of the elite here, because how do you frame it? Do you say, we represent hegemony, Western-led hegemony? Occasionally it slips out, like, Boris Johnson actually said it once, and, every once in a while it'll slip out, but that's not how they want to present it. So they do have to, in essence, lie about what they're doing.
How about they stop talking about it altogether? And just
hey, how do you lead your crusades? How do you launch your wars? You have to have something. Ideology is really very important. They have what I would say is just sort of, if you look at it strictly, they are very inconsistent about democracy. Again, I mentioned Moldova and Romania. Another instance is Gaza. When Gaza held an election in 2006 and Hamas won, then we immediately clamped down and said we don't recognize that. It's about outcomes. And, we've talked about what's happened in Georgia too. It's just like if the wrong person gets elected, it's not a democracy. So it's this Western ideology that has, social, political, aspects to it. In the end, it's just like being part of the Western club and accepting Western values and accepting leadership of the EU and above all the United States. That's really what it comes down to. But you can't really frame it that way because that's just not going to win you a lot of adherence, and it's going to it'd be an admission of really what you're doing. You're trying to impose one system on the rest of the world. So they continue to use these, speak of these universal values. Say it's about democracy, it's about human rights and that kind of thing. When clearly it isn't. I just gave you like we know what's happened in Ukraine and in Gaza and whatever. It's just the opposite of that. But that's going to be the language that they're going to continue to use. What other language can they use?
Interesting. So really that, that language, human rights and democracy, authoritarianism, that's really the language of modern day imperialism, modern day U.S. hegemony. That's why we use it, right? I mean, if we didn't have the desire to expand and stir up all these other things, we wouldn't be using that terminology, because really it'd be like, why are you talking about that country in the first place?
Right.
That the only reason you're using these words is because you're trying to continue to project U.S. hegemony, trying to project dominance, primacy. It is that's it's just imperialism is just evolved into this new thing where we use language and we don't die, we let other people die. We just use the language, Right. It's kind of how it works, right?
Yeah. Right. Well, for example, we use human rights as an excuse for doing all kinds of military interventions and regime changes. It grows out of the right to protect. That's something that came out of the unipolar moment. This right to protect position or thinking that, which actually went very much against the old understanding, which dates all the way back to Westphalia and to the United Nations too. It's just that countries are sovereign, and we have to respect their sovereignty. Otherwise, we won't have any peace. We can't intervene in other countries because we don't like them or we don't like their political systems. That was the understanding that actually goes all the way back to Westphalia in the 17th century, and which has been kind of reincarnated in the last century as the United Nations and international law. But a right to protect, it sounds good to say, well, if, we can't use that as an excuse, respecting sovereignty. If a country is actually persecuting certain people in their country, they're violating human rights, we need to intervene. And that was used for example, in Serbia. It turns out on false pretenses. That's what happens. The thing about it is it's used very selectively. This idea that's in general what this rules-based international order is. It's an alternative to international law and sovereignty and multipolarity. It's okay. We're the international community. We get to set the rules. Nobody really knows exactly what the rules, but we set them selectively. It's like we're concerned about human rights here, but not about them there. And when you do that, when you apply some kind of standard very selectively and inconsistently, what are you doing? You're weaponizing that particular, argument. Right. So the right to protect. Okay. That sounds like a reasonable position. But you don't apply it consistently. You just apply it here and there, and you often on false pretenses. You've weaponized it, and you now have a weapon, in your arsenal for intervening, for attacking countries that are not, compliant. One good example again is Serbia.
Yeah, so we're weaponizing all these things that are supposed to be great and holy kind of parts of our way of life, or things that like human rights. That's something that's supposed to be that we should all get behind of, but we weaponize it, we've tainted it, and we weaponize democracy, as well. Just all these things we've
weaponized the dollar.
The dollar. Well, I mean, I think this is things like democracy or human rights. I think that's why they have been able to be weaponized, because they're shrouded in that, that protection of like, this is such a great thing, you got to be behind it. And we've just made it into such a terrible thing. It's a real shame. It's another dark mark on us. The more I kind of realize, it's like, man, this whole thing was all sinister. the language you use, what the pretexts and the pretenses we used to go to war. And now we're off the coast of Venezuela. I mean, is this going to happen? Do you think we're going to do this for democracy,
I think
for
so,
human
but
rights, for freedom?
Yeah. Well, in this case, we use that language in reference. We say that he's illegitimate, he stole the election, that the people there are oppressed, and so on and so forth. But a lot of it is about this. The main focus here has been on the drug trade, which is just entirely false.
What do you think the soldiers and the sailors, what do you think they're thinking? Do you think that they understand? Because if the vast majority of Americans are like, this doesn't make any sense, I'm sure they have contact with their family. Are they being just sort of fed some propaganda, Maduro horror snuff films, like on the boats to just be like, gear them up, be like, this is why we got to kill these people? Because I haven't, it's not a normal. I just feel like I would be asking questions on this boat. I'd be like, wait, so.
Right. I'm sure.
Why are we here? Why are we attacking? I mean, are there hearts in it? You got to get that morale up, right? How are you going to do that in a case like this?
Yeah. Well, I just don't know. I'm sure there are some. I don't know how many are questioning it. From the experience of past wars, I think we can say with confidence that a lot of them many of these military personnel are waking up to the reality. And certainly when it's all over, they will realize that they were used. A good portion of them will. I just don't know how large that proportion is going to be.